I had this feeling when we were with this oak tree, this oak tree who was certainly old enough to have been tended to and had interactions with tribal people, with Esselen folks, and this feeling from the oak tree of like, where have you been? There was like a quality of sadness. There was a quality of almost like a scolding quality to it as well. It wasn't just like, I'm so happy to see you. There was a heaviness to it. It's like, where have you been? That may have been in my imagination. That may have been dialogue. I don't know. I don't feel particularly attached to it being one way or the other. It has meaning for me regardless of what it actually was. Nested in that meaning is this idea of like, maybe these other beings miss us too. Not because we're super special or great, but just because we're just one member of the family that's been missing for a long time.
Welcome to Voices of Esselen. I'm Sam Stern. Today my guests are Noël Vietor and Fletcher Tucker, co-founders of Wildtender, a group that offers immersive wilderness programs that cultivate intimacy with the natural world, connect with wisdom traditions, and nurture human wholeness. In this particular moment of history that we find ourselves in, I feel like there is a call to reawaken our inherent belonging to the earth and to cultivate a relationship with land that is based on deep listening and coexistence. Wildtender answers that call. Today, in this conversation, Noël and Fletcher guide us through their philosophy, which is rooted in the ancient paths of kincentric animism, embodied awareness, and the deep, interconnected wisdom of living beings. We've been trying to do an interview for probably 2-3 years or something like that, and I want to recognize our deep connection and my respect for the work that both of you do and the way that you've kind of dedicated your working lives and lives outside of work to the work that you do. You're very purpose-driven people, and so I have a great deal of appreciation for both of you and the artistic way that you live your lives and the purpose-driven way that you live your lives.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I mean, we go way back, working in the farm and garden together and being in a Gestalt process and, now in the present raising daughters in Big Sur who are the same age and kind of going through that at the same time. So it's all been very rich and fertile, ongoing process of knowing each other.
Would you bring me into your Esselen origin story? Bring me into what brought you here and how you engaged with Esselen when you were first here.
Well, like a lot of people, I came here in a time of personal seeking and transition. Not a super unusual story of just kind of jumping into a young professional, somewhat corporate life in a city and not feeling very connected with that work or like I was in the right alignment with my life or my purpose. So in my mid-20s, I kind of stumbled upon Esalen Institute and particularly the farm and garden. I just felt so drawn to the idea of getting to be in a place of just being outdoors all day and putting my hands in the dirt and learning something really tactile, like how to grow food. Esselen had this, really amazing 9-month apprenticeship that I kind of convinced them to let me in, even though I had no practical experience or qualifications. But I kind of sold them on a story that, I would take it back to the corporate world, my hands-on knowledge, and, apply it in some grandiose way. Yeah, I found myself here in January of 2010, which was, we now have become more acquainted with the term atmospheric rivers in California, like these torrential storms. But I feel like they've always happened in Big Sur, and that winter was so stormy and tumultuous, and it was kind of unexpected landing here, just sort of expecting that I would have this lovely experience of gardening and not having much expectation on top of that. And yeah, kind of arriving into this more like psycho-spiritually dynamic terrain. And I quip that I came for the farming and stayed for the Gestalt, but what I didn't know would be a part of the experience were these weekly Gestalt process meetings with every work department at the Esalen Institute, where all of the crew members or team members would sit together with a Gestalt facilitator and share authentically how we were doing, in our hearts and our spirits and our day-to-day grievances. We started talking about that work as relational agriculture. There was this really deliberate focus on connecting people not only with the land, with themselves, but also with each other, like that it was really a communitarian practice. It was an intense period for me of self-discovery and challenging in a lot of ways. The most unexpected and radical aspect of my farm and garden time was getting to be in these weekly Gestalt sessions with the Gestalt facilitator. And in my case, it was mostly Dorothy Charles, who is a student of the co-founder Dick Price and really carries his lineage of Gestalt practice. For me, like sitting in a room of people and hearing from them about their authentic experience, about what is present for them, was actually as fascinating as it was getting to like dive into my own personal stuff.
Yeah, I was in some of those sessions because I was a work scholar at the time where you were a farm and garden apprentice, and I too was nurtured so much by those circles that were something that was, I guess, new to me. I had been in circles before, but there was something about the way that it was facilitated by Dorothy that led me to feel, I remember there was something that I was so ashamed of revealing about myself. And Dorothy made me look around at the different people who were looking at me, you know, and she was like, well, what do you see in their eyes? And I was kind of moved to tears by understanding that they were going to accept me no matter what I said, almost, you know. And that was this feeling of being accepted by the land here too, and by the greater environment here. So I understand. I haven't not heard this term relational agriculture, but I kind of understand what you're getting at with that.
Yeah, I think that is so important. Just kind of that healing of being seen and being held in compassionate awareness by other people can be so reparative too. Like these early stories or kind of wounded parts of ourselves that believe that we should be ashamed, or that we have something to hide, or, you know, that people won't love us or, you know, appreciate us, or whatever it is. We co-led a program with Dorothy earlier this summer called Wild Presence, Relational Gestalt Practice in the Natural World. And someone asked her, like, you know, this is really amazing being in a group together, but like, how is it working one-on-one? And she was like, it's good. I like working one-on-one, but being together in a group, like, many awarenesses are more powerful than one awareness. And there's something that kind of can collectively happen in this group formation, especially when people are showing up with respect and in sort of an intention to be compassionate or withhold judgment and just be kind with each other.
What Noël was just saying really brought something up for me of talking about that idea of like the being witnessed and held, and this quality of many awarenesses being greater than the sum of its parts, which is what Gestalt means, right? I mean, for us in our work, then that field of relationship, that field of relationality extends beyond that circle of human contact into these concentric circles of more than human contact. So, and you've both talked about this already. You've touched on this idea of that the land was also nourishing and holding and bearing witness. The land was providing you with, well, the land was providing. Our work with Wildtender is absolutely related and informed by this relational agriculture and Gestalt traditions that come out of the Esalen Institute, in that it's fundamentally relational work. It's work about building and cultivating and understanding one's relationship with oneself, with one's human community, and with a more than human community. Or if you'd like, you could say like ecological self would be another way of saying it.
Fletcher, before we jump into bigger ideas, tell me about how you arrived at Esselen.
Yeah, I mean, I really joyfully and easefully just kind of slid in on Noël's coattails to get down here to the Esalen Institute.
I remember you long hair, blonde, guitar playing.
Yeah.
Happy, joyous. It's always like the boyfriends and girlfriends and partners who are like super joyous. They're not doing much work and they're down at the band.
Exactly. I don't know if the term still exists here, but the absolute golden ring of Esalen Institute participation was space mate, which is how I was defined. But yeah, I was eking out a livelihood as itinerant musician living in the Bay Area, and Noël decided to make this big transition down here, and I was fortunate enough to 6 months later just follow suit and come down, start working in the farm and garden, begin my own apprenticeship there. And really, really rapidly, there was just, for me, every day, this ever deepening sense of relatedness, connection, kinship, and devotion to this land, the land itself, by waking up early in the morning and having my hands in the soil all day, and in the water, washing the lettuce in the sink, so, preparing the food to be eaten, taking that food and water into my own body from the land, literally rebuilding myself from this place, in a very concrete way, the food and the water that we're growing and collecting. And so that devotion and affinity to this local patch of earth naturally started to expand out into this greater landscape of Esselen tribal land that we now call Big Sur, that is, represents this tremendously ecologically diverse and exquisitely beautiful and, from my perspective, numinously charged wilderness, much of it intersected and woven through with these networks of trails that extend far and wide across the backcountry into these incredibly unusual ecological niches and beautiful terrains. And so, yeah, most weekends where we weren't farming, we were hiking, and we were either, spending the day out on a trail or many days journeying through this wilderness, mostly just with the intention of just getting to know the place and bearing witness, just beholding the place. Yeah, so that work, became, that could very well just be a hobby for someone, of course, and that's a beautiful, wonderful thing to be celebrated. But for whatever reason, my spirit was called into service, into this relationship and this way of relating. And it became clear to me that forming these deep relationships, finding ways of connecting, building relationship, and then eventually finding ways of helping other people connect and form meaningful, long-lasting, embodied relationships with other than human beings, with landscape, and in particular this specific place, Big Sur, which has taught me and nourished me and brought me so much, that became a deep, abiding orientation for my life. I think this is a common story for everyone who teaches, for lack of a better word. It's like eventually somebody's gonna show up and want to do what you're doing or learn from what you're doing. And that just started to happen naturally. Different people hearing stories about like, oh wow, like you hiked from the coast to Sahara, like how did you do that? What was that like? An initial kind of fascination or infatuation with the actual sort of maybe like the most like sort of surface level of the experience, like just what we were actually doing with our bodies. And then once we started to do these things with our bodies, take people out into the wild and introduce them to the practices we've developed and our ways of relating that we've uncovered and rediscovered and encountered, then that the role as guide and as teacher and facilitator just deepens over time.
Let's talk about the worldview that you espouse with Wildtender. I'd love to begin with this notion of kincentric animism. What is this, and how does it shape your work?
In essence, what those words point to is just an acknowledgement of the fundamental aliveness and awareness that proliferates the cosmos, that is like this fundamental tissue of reality. It's the acknowledgement that this world is full of beings, persons even, some of whom are human, some of whom are not. That's how Graham Harvey defines animism, as this perspective that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, right? And I think what's important about that idea is that if you actually believe that, if you actually act from that perspective, it's going to affect every action you make throughout your life. And from my perspective, it's going to deeply enrich reality. Because we're talking about relationships, we're talking about relationality. I can't have a meaningful relationship with a landscape or with a place or with a world that's just full of a bunch of dead, lifeless stuff, right? But I can have deep, meaningful, reciprocal relationship with other beings, other human beings and other non-human or other than human beings.
What would be an example of having a relationship with like a non-human being?
Again, it begins with regard, right? But I mean, there are people listening right now who have relationships already with non-human beings, like their cat or their dog or parakeet or, and then there's, if you examine that field a little more closely, maybe there's a houseplant, maybe you have a garden, maybe you have a tree that you visit in the park that's 2 blocks away from your house, and you don't know why, but you go there and whenever you walk in the park, you put your hand on the tree, lovingly, even like a caress, like the way you would greet your auntie or grandmother. And this is probably already a component of daily life, and the reason for that, I believe, is that this is like the foundational way of relating of our species, and that this modern overlay is really new. This modern overlay that is this highly mechanistic, materialistic worldview that in fact we're just isolated and alone in this world.
Would the idea be that this is something that kind of came into being around the Industrial Revolution?
Different people place these ideas at different time periods, and I think it's important to acknowledge that neither of us are historians. Honestly, the thing that makes the most sense to me is that the divide actually is about certain Greek philosophers and this initial separation that some ancient Greek people made of this idea of separating matter and spirit. This idea that there's like a physical stuff and then there's spirit stuff. And slowly that idea of there being physical stuff and there being spirit material became more and more and more isolated to human beings. And it's like, here we are, human beings with souls, and then everything else is just sort of material, right? But of course, that's not where ancient Greeks started. They had like this beautiful way of relating as kin to other than human subjectivities to the land and the beings of the land, and then these like, spirit beings, seen, seldom seen, unseen, dryads and naiads and et cetera, et cetera. And there's stories from that time period of this new philosophy taking hold, and actual written accounts of people saying, we're not able to make contact with these naiads, these water spirits anymore, or like these ceremonies that we've been performing at these holy wells don't appear to be functioning anymore. So this like overlay of this different way of perceiving and relating to the world actually working as an erosive and erasive force for this other older, more fundamental animistic or kincentric or panpsychic, or however, there are lots of different words, way of relating back to the other than human, the more than human. There's stories from my own ancestral lineage, which is primarily in Scandinavia. There's the same stories or similar stories of folks around the 12th and 11th century when Christianity was starting to creep in a hegemonic way up through Scandinavia, and people talking about encountering, like villagers in remote villages, encountering fairies and gnomes and trolls with carts leaving the countryside, and because they said, it's the church bells are making this racket and the people aren't leaving offerings for us anymore, and there's so we're out of here. We're going to funnily enough, they'd always say they're going to Norway. I'm going to Norway. I'm just going to go move to Norway where there were less people. These stories which you can interpret as like directly or mythopoetically as you would like. To me, it doesn't really matter, but they're stories about subjectivity being wrung out of the world or being pushed out of the world, and objectivity, regard of the world as objects rather than as a community of subjects, being forced into every corner of human culture and awareness.
Yes.
And so our work is, with Wildtender, is an attempt to offer people an embodied experience of relating back to the world reciprocally and kincentrically, animistically, if you will, an opportunity for people in a living, embodied way to cultivate relationships, reciprocal relationships, to find meaning, to restore ancient bonds of connection and relationality. Yeah?
Yeah, and I just want to add that I think when we're talking about these concepts, it's really important to acknowledge and honor that the strongest kind of thought leadership in tending to these concepts now and through the deep past has happened with Indigenous people. And some of the, even for us personally, like really formative, inspiring ideas have come from writers and thinkers who are Indigenous and are modeling ways of tending to the land and relating to the land in a deeply reciprocal and familial manner. So the name of our project, Wildtender, where that comes from is around the same time that we were farming at Esselen and hiking the backcountry. We encountered the book Tending the Wild by M. Anderson, which really kind of recasts the story of California. I would say in brief, when settlers like John Muir came here, they saw the wilderness and they thought, wow, this is this untouched wilderness. It's so pristine and we know what industrial forces can do. Let's protect it and let's get people off of it, including Indigenous people. And basically, the book Tending the Wild unpacks just what a huge miscalculation and misperception that was, that in reality, California and all the lands of Turtle Island have basically been like a garden. So, they've been really tended and managed in thoughtful ways and through really time-tested strategies like fire management. So for us, it was just kind of this big aha moment of, wow, there could be a different way of relating to nature and the natural world and places and how we steward them. So it's kind of an aspirational concept because we aren't, we're not teaching people about like wildlife rehabilitation or specific ways of reforesting lands or even fire ecology, or really, we'll touch on that sometimes abstractly or philosophically, but where our work is more situated in kind of the beginning of the journey, which is just about trying to shift consciousness and shift perception and our worldview. And our hope is always that people will kind of come through the process of waking up and trying on a different way of relating and experiencing the natural world or the wilderness, and that they will then feel deeply inspired or called to care for the places that they love and call home.
So just building on a little bit on what Noël said about just honoring and acknowledging the Indigenous thought leadership around the kinship worldview, even just the term that we were using, the kincentric, that's a term that was coined by Enrique Salmon, who's he's a professor in the Bay Area of Native American Studies, and he's a Raramuri descendant. And so he's done this beautiful work of cataloging and presenting all these plant to human, human to plant kinship relationships of Native people across Turtle Island. Published a beautiful book about that. Yeah, and then some other folks, Tyson Youngpura is who wrote the book Sand Talk. A really incredible thinker in this field, very precise and I think like almost, I've kind of almost like mystically gifted, I think, in his ability through words to actually like disrupt and challenge like dominant worldview, inherited cultural bias and things like that. Really interesting, beautiful writer and beautiful book. And then
I heard a great interview with Tyson on the show For the Wild.
Oh yeah,
hosted by Ayana Young, and actually, I might be wrong, but I feel like your music was featured on that show.
Oh, it might have been on that one.
Maybe on that show.
It might have been
definitely on that podcast.
Oh yeah. I have given them music to use. Yeah, which I'm honored to have woven into that. Yeah.
Yeah, Ayana Young's wonderful. I've had her as a guest on the show.
Cool. Yeah. And then Robin Wall Kimmerer is like has been lauded and needs to continue to be lauded for her really like generous openness and clarity through which she expresses these ideas of kinship and offers them, to a really wide audience. And I think we just have enormous like gratitude for how far and wide her thoughts and messages have spread. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, of course, and she is a botanist and gardener and member of the Potawatomi Nation. Yeah, I would just like to add one thought regarding the what you were saying, Noel, about Wildtender and the name and where it's coming from. Thinking about the dominant worldview and these sort of unobserved ways of regarding the world and ourselves and our relationship with the world. And it feels true to me that a lot of people, maybe most people, kind of inherit these two seemingly disparate mythologies or false mythologies from my perspective of about like what it means to be a human being. And they seem disparate, but they're actually, from my perspective, totally related. And there's either this like exaltation of the human as either being like through divine provenance or mechanistic, materialistic, brain-powered superiority of this being like destined for dominion over the earth, or this idea of human beings as essentially functioning more like a virus and just being like this grotesque outcast destined to be destructive and the world would be better off without us, right? And they seem separate, but really they both are about human exceptionalism and isolation, right? And the end result is thinking of ourselves in either of those ways is extreme existential isolation and loneliness and just separateness from all that is, right? And yet, this model that's really well showcased in M. Ket Anderson's work of tending the wild and this idea of wild tending and present throughout human culture once you dig down to the level of a land-connected people, is that there's this other way of being, which is about reciprocal relationship. And from that emerges innate human capacity to actually be beneficial co-inhabitants of landscape, to participate with other than human beings in peaceful and collaborative ways for the benefit of all types of beings. And this is still existing in the world today and shown and illustrated and proven with the reality that like land-connected people, indigenous folks who continue to practice within their like traditions outside of modernity, those isolated places, which unfortunately are very few and far between, are the places on the planet that have the greatest biodiversity. They are the places that have the most diversity of life and also sustainability of life. And so it's not the places where people have been removed from landscape or have chosen to separate themselves from place. Those places actually relatively quickly become simplified in terms of their diversity. So human beings can actually be these beneficial co-inhabitants. And we have been, and may we be again. That's our hope. Though? Well, we have been historically.
Is there evidence to show that we were not just a bunch of warring factions who were happy to enslave one another?
I mean, yes, there is evidence. I mean, and I think a really important, if we just ground it where we actually are, we can talk about here in Big Sur, like the deep culture of this place are the Esselen, the Esselen Tribe. And so we're talking about at least 9,000 years of like continuous sustainable inhabitation. And I think it's important not to over romanticize our deeper time ancestors. It's important not to over romanticize indigenous cultures or land-based cultures or place-based cultures, because that's actually another form of othering,
Right.
And people are people, and people do people-y things, and historically people don't behave perfectly to one another or to the place. But there is I believe, a deeper story of a greater balance, a greater harmony, a greater reciprocity that is lost when we become so fixated on the shorter term stories of modernity, which is it's reasonable. It's what we're swimming in. It's the Anthropocene.
It might just be useful to define that term.
The Anthropocene, yeah. Eras or epochs, planetary eras or epochs have been defined in geologic terms, like the Pleistocene, and these large natural shifts and events that change climate, that change where plants are growing, they're geological events sometimes, things like that. More recently, people have been referring to this age that we're living through as the Anthropocene, in order to shed light on the fact and the reality that our human actions and human culture are actually the largest driving engine of change on a planetary level. So pointing back to human beings as, in particular, causing major shifts in climate, but, biodiversity, and even just the surface of the earth, the reality that so much of the earth is now covered in concrete, right? Literally changing the surface of the earth. So yeah, the Anthropocene, referring to this modern era that we are living through. And I mean, when I say modern era, I'm talking about like the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. That's what feels true to me. But then there's another, depending on who you talk to, 300,000 years or so of human history before that, where we weren't perfect by any means, but we also weren't driving at 700 miles per hour towards a cliff of a mass extinction and, the termination of our own species as well, right? So, I mean, 300,000 years, that's a pretty good run. Like, that sounds like pretty good sustainability to me. You know what I mean?
I want to tell you about Wildtender and Eselen's partner program called Wild Pilgrimage, a backpacking journey to Esselen happening April 29th to May 5th, 2024. This is a 4-day, highly intentional, guided backpacking trip through Big Sur Wilderness, which concludes at Esselen for a weekend of integration, rejuvenation, and further exploration. Folks in this one-of-a-kind workshop will embody a contemporary form of pilgrimage, traveling as reverent guests through a biodiverse and sacred wilderness, historic Esselen tribal territory. Inspired by Esalen Institute's co-founder Dick Price, who found healing and transformation wandering the Big Sur wild, participants will engage in Gestalt practices from the Esselen lineage, including group check-ins to help connect with themselves, each other, and the land. As you hike and camp, you'll receive what the landscape reveals, encounter philosophies and poetry of the wild, and learn foundational wilderness ethics and backpacking skills. Wild Pilgrimage will be facilitated by Wildtender co-founder Fletcher Tucker, Esselen workshop leader, longtime student of Gestalt, and current guest on this podcast, as well as Emily Linders, nature-based psychotherapist and former Zen monk. This is the 5th year Wild Pilgrims will make their way through the backcountry to Esselen. It is a truly immersive and transformative experience centered in pan-ancestral traditions of kinship and Esselen's own Gestalt tradition. It happens but once a year, so if you're feeling the call, I highly recommend signing up at wildtender.com. Once again, those dates are April 29th to May 5th, 2024. Read more about it and register at wildtender.com.
I mean, we don't espouse trying to reset the clock and going back to being Stone Age people.
Right.
But we are interested in learning from our deeper time ancestors and acknowledging that there's wisdom back there that we've just thrown out, and that we can hopefully incorporate into, a more balanced presentation of ourselves in the present and future moment. We're focused right now in the way that we're talking about those outcomes or the way that maybe some of these things could affect change in the world and things like that. And that's really meaningful and important. But for me, there's also this deeper kind of calling or belief in that, like, by cultivating reciprocal relationships with the more than human world, with landscape, with other than human beings, I deepen who I am and I become who I actually am, right?
Yes.
And so regardless of outcome, regardless of our ability or inability to avoid catastrophe, in this time, in this incarnation, I get to be who I actually am. I get to feel the joy of unraveling and dismantling and doing away with some of that isolation and that pain. Yeah. And I have the honor and the privilege and the obligation to do that for and with other people, right? Regardless, again, of the outcome, just because it is in and of itself inherently meaningful. Within some Buddhist traditions, they talk about like this idea that one moment of actual clarity is enough to sustain you for 1,000 lifetimes.
When we're doing our work with people in wild spaces, we talk about how the process of returning to some of these deeper ways of being human and being connected with the natural world, it really can feel and be more like a process of remembering. I think people are really surprised at how quickly they can actually kind of tap into this other way of being that's not so analytical. And like, people will come to our workshops or our programs and just be like, I'm so disconnected. Like, I don't know anything about nature, teach me. Like, and what I feel like I see is like people just kind of so quickly become adept. And one of the kind of like tools or pathways that we find really useful are connecting people to their senses, because it kind of takes them out of the mental space a little bit. So, in the beginning of a workshop, let's say we're on the beginning of a trail, we may introduce a plant that has a really strong fragrance, and we know all about it. We know the medicinal and ecological and ethnobotanical, backstory of this plant, but we'll first kind of invite people to connect and drop in with their own somatic intake of a plant through, smell or maybe through taste. And we'll ask them, like, what do you notice? What do you experience? And it's so crazy how often people will actually be able to sort of somatically identify like that kind of medicinal association of a plant. Like, there's things that are happening in our animal bodies that, like, we may live our entire lives in urban landscapes. I mean, I myself, like, I grew up in urban and suburban landscapes. I was not very connected to nature. Like I said, when I first came to Esselen, I couldn't tell the difference between like a kale and a lettuce plant. I mean, it was really like very beginner level. So it can be this incredibly deep process of researching and reading like field guides and talking to elders and, learning all about the land and the beings who dwell here. But like I said, there also is this simplicity of just kind of like just walking in my human animal body and connecting with my senses and feeling my breath, that like magical things can start to happen.
Returning to this idea of a worldview and shifting consciousness, I feel like I understand that Wildtender has a very intentional relationship to language. And I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about the ways that language and the way that we interact with it can sort of influence the way that we work with the world and see the world.
Yeah, absolutely. We are not alone in arriving at this conclusion at all. Right. But we have arrived at it, and it is like seated very centrally in my own personal practice and also in my role within Wildtender. It's just this belief that the way that I speak about the world deeply informs the way that I see and relate with the world. My world speaking is my world shaping. and that language is powerful, and my thoughts follow my words and my words follow my thoughts, and they're always in this reciprocal dance, And so I've taken it very seriously to really try to garden my language. I choose my words wisely as I can throughout my life, but specifically within these practices, I'm practicing this kind of language gardening of choosing how to refer to other than human beings. I mean, even that word that I'm using right now, other than human being, is not particularly common in modern parlance, but it's specific because I'm acknowledging beinghood, and I'm also acknowledging that beinghood extends beyond humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think where this shows up most in our work is often really in pronouns. So commonly somebody would refer to a redwood tree as it. That's what comes up for most people. That's what we've been conditioned into, is this idea that anything that isn't a person is an it, right? So that's objectification. Like, it is a word we use for objects, but he, she, and they, those are words we use for persons, right? And
so what pronoun might you use for redwood?
Yeah, so I default mostly to they, because I don't want to superimpose some human construct of binary gender on a redwood tree. Mm-hmm. I mean, some beings have sex, they have their, male and female hawks, for example, like a red-tailed hawk. I could tell the difference between a male red-tailed hawk and a female red-tailed hawk. And I might use he or she then, but also, I mean, I don't know what their conceit of their gender is, so that in some ways I'm identifying their sex, but that doesn't actually really overlay into identity, right? But I may use he or she then. I may use he or she just as a way of drawing people's attention to the fact that I'm, referring to poison oak as he, like, be careful, you might get some of his oils on your boots, just as a way, not because I believe poison oak is inherently male, but it just draws attention to that, right? Again, they is a great one because, for instance, there's fungi that have 75 different sexes, So it's like, what am I'm really reducing them by calling them he or she. This specifically, this he, she, they idea or way of communicating came up for me when I was a gardening teacher. I worked at our local elementary school. I ran a gardening program there for about 4 or 5 years, and I was working with little kids. And it's something I started to do with the kids as a way of drawing their attention into the agency, the aliveness, the awareness, the beinghood of these plants that we were working with. And they could adopt it right away. For one thing, kids are used to being corrected all the time about the way they talk about stuff, right? But grown-ups aren't. And then wonderfully, within, like a year of just sort of coming to that practice on my own, I encountered it very beautifully expressed in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, The Braiding Sweetgrass. She has a whole chapter devoted to what she refers to as language of animacy, or grammar of animacy, she says. Yeah. So again, beyond pronouns though, it's like if I were to take someone on a hike and they encounter, we're smelling hedge nettle, they're going to say, what is it? Yeah. Right. But instead, little subtle shift to the left. Who is this? Right. Right. And
yeah.
And it's just change. I'm just changing one word there, but I'm in that word. There is this whole possibility of relationality that is absolutely absent from what, right? And so it affects the way I'm going to relate. And it also is, about mutual regard and respect and just, why should I be depriving this creek of potential beinghood by saying, what's this creek called,
Right.
Right. Instead, like, does anyone know who this is,
I love that.
Yeah.
Do you get funny looks from some of your people?
Yeah, I do. Oftentimes, I would say more often it goes under the radar than it gets like a quizzical look, and then, but typically, way we like to work is just do it. Like, it's the water that I'm swimming in. It's the words that I am intentionally using anyway. So I'm going to do it no matter what. do it for a couple days, and then, day 2 or 3, ask anybody what they've noticed. Like, have you noticed, is there anything you've noticed about the way that I speak about these other than humans, about our plant kin? Have you noticed anything, And then people say, people will notice. And then a lot of people will just get it intuitively. And then other people will have questions about it. And then we invite people just to try it on. Like, if we're leading a, workshop here for a week at the Esalen Institute, it's like, just try it out. See what it's like. What does it feel like?
Yeah, and I think it's just important to clarify, it's not that we necessarily believe that this is the thing. Like, if we change the way that we talk, this is going to be the game-changing thing that, this is going to repair the way that we relate to the world and everything's going to be magically better. It's kind of like, this is just one type of way to sort of untangle some of our conditioning. And I think all languages have epistemologies embedded in them, right? And there are different ways of being kind of embedded in these ways of talking. So yeah, just changing our way of talking a little bit helps us try something different in like an existential way.
Let's talk about Wild Pilgrimage, this program that you'll be leading at Esselen. When will it be happening? And tell me about the program, please.
It's April 29th to May 5th. And we should say that sometimes Fletcher and I co-lead programs. This one, Fletcher will be co-leading with a wonderful friend and Wildtender guide, Emily Linders, who is a really interesting person who we met after she hiked the opposite direction from having been she was a monk and resident at the time at the Tassajara Zen Center, and hiked all the way to Esselen.
Wild Pilgrimage is a multi-day, highly intentional backpacking journey through the Big Sur wilderness. We begin on the coast and we make a loop through the wilderness, spending 4 nights camped out, learning about and from the land, learning about and from one another, different practices that we've inherited and created specifically within the Gestalt tradition, which we see as like one of the great lineages of the Esalen Institute, using the Gestalt tradition as to build relationship with the more than human, with the other than human, and with oneself, and with this temporary community of beings, this circle, of human people. And then it concludes with a weekend here at the Esalen Institute of integration and rest and expansion. And it's this beautiful opportunity to just radically simplify, everyone's carrying everything they need for those 5 days in the wilderness, those 4 nights, 5 days. Anything you need is on your back, and if it's not on your back, you're not going to use it, for a few days. And just to spend all the daylight hours walking through the wild with lots of space and quietude, and just being in the practice of just being with this world as it is, full of life and awareness and beauty.
Pilgrimage is an ancient pan-cultural tradition. I think probably every part of the world has pilgrimages. Often they're pilgrimages to sacred or religious sites. They have destinations. Often they are moving through wild spaces, regardless. And sometimes the wild space is in and of itself the spiritual destination. But yeah, we use this term at the risk of maybe seeming pretentious or overly serious, because we want to endow it with a lot of intention and meaning, and have these journeys that we are undertaking be serious, like that people realize that this isn't a guided interpretive backpacking trip. If you want that, there's plenty of places to find that. We are really approaching it with a more intentional spirit. And yeah, we've just found that the combination of the physical ardor and the the challenge of hiking all day long and kind of wearing our bodies out and moving through rugged landscape and passing brush and, feeling the sun beating on me all day and the weight of my pack. That combined with, everyday walking with a level of intentionality and silence and space and reverence, awe and wonder, that plus the communitarian aspect of being with an intimate group that is walking together, and coming together at points like at the end of the day at camp to tell the stories of the day and to share what's arising. That whole combination we've just found to be incredibly powerful, and we choose to call these pilgrimages because we are part of this Esselen Gestalt wilderness tradition that Steven Harper and Dick Price, began. And Steven Harper himself led pilgrimages to and from Esselen and to and from the Tassajara Zen Center. But yeah, we consider this like a contemporary pan-cultural approach to pilgrimage and to sanctifying wild space together.
Noël was saying, pilgrimage is this like sacred pan-ancestral practice. Retreat is another word for another concept that's also exists across countless cultures and all these different modalities, and just this idea of intentionally taking time away from your individual demands of daily existence, setting it aside, making sacred time to do a different kind of work, to do inner work, to be present for yourself and for the place and for each other in a way that is difficult or impossible in daily life.
And one of the components of traditional pilgrimage that I think sometimes gets overlooked or forgotten about now when we think about it, is the idea of like bringing back the boon to one's community. Mm-hmm. So if you think about like in a village, maybe hundreds of years ago, someone might undertake a pilgrimage on behalf of the whole village and be expected to bring back those spiritual fruits, or to make offerings on behalf of the whole community. And, that wouldn't just be a treasured, personal, precious experience, but that would be something to be shared. And so we really walk with that intention of like, yes, let's nourish ourselves through this way of being immersed on the land and in a very thoughtful community for 5 days. And as we turn toward the weekend at Esalen Institute and thinking about integration, that starts to come into play a little bit too, of like, well, what does this mean for me? What am I taking back into my life, and how am I changed? I mean, and a lot of times people do feel changed. Like there's big implications once they let themselves kind of connect in this way.
Related to what you were saying, Noël, about the idea of like making these offerings on behalf of the community and it having like value that extends beyond one's personal experience. And I think that for me, that brings up some thoughts about the way that we're entering into pilgrimage or into any of these practices of attempting to sense into, embody, and express kinship, and that having like this larger value beyond personal experience, and potentially and truthfully from my perspective, my own lived experience, it having value for our kin as well, and having meaning that extends beyond my own meaning making. It brings to mind this experience that I had of when we first moved to into the larger Big Sur community after we had finished living at Esalen Institute, then discovering nearby this beautiful matriarch of a coast live oak tree that was just making these enormous, glorious acorns that were just so beautiful, and us organizing a little gathering of friends to come and collect acorns and process them into some food. And I had this feeling when we were with this oak tree, where we were all gathering the acorns, this oak tree who was certainly old enough to have been tended to and had interactions with tribal people, with Esselen folks, and this feeling from the oak tree of like, if I were to put it into words, it would be like almost like a statement of like, where have you been? And it was like, it had a quality of, there was like a quality of sadness. There was a quality of almost like a scolding quality to it as well. It wasn't just like, I'm so happy to see you. It was like there was a heaviness to it. It's like, where have you been?
Yes.
Right? That may have been in my imagination. That may have been dialogue. I don't know. I don't feel particularly attached to it being one way or the other, but it has meaning. It has meaning for me regardless of what it actually was. And the meaning is, nested in that meaning is this idea of like, maybe our kinfolk, maybe these other beings miss us too, not because we're super special or great, but just because we're like we're just one member of the family that's been missing for a long time. And so like when we step into the wild in pilgrimage or in some other form of ceremony or intentionality in one of our programs or in some other way, there's this possibility of this joyful reunion and this very meaningful reunion that's benefiting me as an individual, but it's hopefully, and the intention is, and for me it feels just true, so I'm just going to say it, is like acknowledged and understood and has value and healing capacity for the landscape and for the other than human subjectivities of the land. And so in that way, it's like it extends beyond just some extractionistic like experience of like, oh, I get to have a cool trip or a cool experience, or I feel better afterwards. And ideally grounds it back into like reciprocity, relationship,
Thank you so much for this deep dive into your world and your ways of thinking. I feel like my own thoughts about existing in the world have been shifted, and I feel like my curiosity has been piqued, and I feel like I have my tool kit is a little larger for having sort of been expanded to the thoughts that guide your work. So really want to express deep gratitude for the rigorousness and the depth of exploration that you two have done and continue to do. And I'd love to have you back on the show sometime. I feel like we could talk, way more. We could talk for hours. There's more. I know. Would you mind telling me how people can find out more about the work that you do?
Sure. Yeah. And Sam, I just want to say I'm so honored to be on this podcast. I listened to it. I recommend it. Like, we put it on our Wildtender recommendations list. I just think that you are doing such important work of holding the history and the legacies of Esselen and also bringing in these newer voices. And yeah, I just think that the podcast is really dynamic and wonderful, and I appreciate your work at Esselen. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to be in dialogue with you. And yeah, in terms of our work, in addition to leading programs at the Esalen Institute, we also lead just Wildtender programs, some backcountry journeys and pilgrimages, and some front country day hiking and shorter form like camping retreats, all based in the outdoors. So our website is wildtender.com, like tending the wild, wildtender.com. Yeah, please. If people are curious, I encourage you to just reach out and find our email on the website, and we'd love to be in touch. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esselen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Want to write to me? Tell me how the show has changed your life? Tell me who you think I should interview? Email us at voicesofesselen@gmail.com. I will answer you, I promise. And while you're at it, please take a moment to rate and review this show on whatever podcast player you're listening to. That would be a kind move on your part.